Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining our webinar this afternoon. My name is Stuart Little, company's IRT Surveys. We are joined today by a fairly compelling group of thought leaders from the world of asset management. So just introduce them around the table, if I may. First up is Miranda Plowden. Miranda is an asset manager and strategic manager for South Yorkshire Housing Association. They have around 5,000 houses under management. Miranda's comments are very much appreciated. Thanks for joining us today, Miranda. We also have Claire Curtis-Thomas, the CEO of the British Board of Agrimont. Claire joined us today to share her insight and experience into the current failures and what's around the corner from the BBA's point of view. We're also joined today by Sebastian van Dort. Sebastian's a senior manager for the delivery of ECO, which is the energy company obligation, with a fairly innovative utility company called OVO Energy. And last, but by no means least, we're also delighted to have with us today Graham Ellis. Graham's the Associate Director for Residential Surveys with the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. So actually, we're very fortunate today to be joined by a fairly wide and diverse panel of people who have both assets that need management and who are physically doing asset management today, together with people who are actually at the forefront of it and seeing what's going wrong with it and what's around the corner from a variety of different viewpoints. For my tuppence worth, we've been surveying buildings now for about 15 years with infrared technology. At the end of this webinar, there is a very short presentation on how we see the future of asset management, primarily using software to improve data, to point out integrity problems, and to help people actually leverage things like eco-funding and ensure that their assets are managed efficiently, that budgets are optimized, and that we do actually manage to leverage funding efficiently and effectively. I realise that the audience is predominantly housing focused with a lot of commercial asset managers. A lot of the comments are housing focused today, but many of the same problems and challenges apply to the commercial world. So please listen in. We are a good 45 minutes for some of these thought leaders. If you can, please hang around for the end. There's a Q&A at the end. You can send us live questions and we will answer them as quickly and as best as we can. Thank you very much and enjoy the webinar. Hi Graham, thank you very much for joining us today and taking the time out of your diary to do the webinar with us. If I can just start by asking you, what are the main challenges in your industry at the moment?
I think it's probably the lack of information that we have on a building when we're looking at it.
Is that from the resident, the owner themselves, or from?
Well, from the owner's perspective and also from somebody who's looking at it from a professional point of view, whether they're doing a survey on it or they're managing it or whatever. Okay.
So to address that problem, what are you recommending as best practice? If you could wave a magic wand and say this is the best practice.
Well, it's often said that surveyors don't have X-ray eyes and they hide behind caveats. But clearly, if the technology is there to give the surveyor more information about things which are happening in the building which they can't see with the naked eye, but the technology can, or the technology may not give the full answer, but it may indicate there's a potential problem there which the surveyor can pick up on and carry out further investigations, such as taking bricks out of the wall or exposure works.
If a building surveyor gets a phone call to go to 14 Acacia Avenue, does he go forewarned and forearmed, or is it just a cold, take it as I find it?
Well, as a surveyor doing an instruction on a property which I probably received the day or day before, no, I'll have no information at all on that property unless the owner has that information, which is highly unlikely. Now, clearly, if it's part of an instruction for a portfolio that I manage, I may very well have the previous information based on surveys and inspections, which is in the database, and that may be held digitally now. But even then, that will be limited to whatever that inspection was carried out at the time.
And do you see, I've gone a little bit off-piste question-wise with you, but do you think the building information modelling, BIM, is going to have an impact on portfolio management?
From what I know about BIM, the answer to that has to be yes. It seems to be an incredible tool in terms of the information that it can be picked up from its use, the way it can be stored and managed. And I think the big problem with BIM at the moment is probably an affordability in terms of your individual homes or whatever. Clearly, it's a different perspective for office buildings and the like, where there is resource to pay for this. But I think as BIM becomes more affordable and maybe tweaked to adopt to cover smaller buildings rather than bigger buildings, then yes, I can see it having a massive impact.
One of the questions we get asked fairly frequently is about the Internet of Things. It's a bit of a buzzword with people saying, hey, well, how does that impact your business? We can see a world where buildings become more and more smart, more and more intelligent, where you've got sensors everywhere constantly feeding a database that could alert an RICS surveyor to say, hey, this room is, the moisture, humidity level's gone up 20% over the last year and a half. Yep. That might then, to a building surveyor, trigger something in his head, in his experience, that says, that looks like failed cavities to me.
Yep.
Just from a sensor, and then visit site and do a more invasive survey or use an infrared camera or whatever that technology happens to be. Is that the sort of future you see when you close your eyes?
There's two ways of looking at this, and they both sort of interact. One is what the surveyor actually does in terms of, sort of site protocol inspection and preparing the report. And we've got a lot to get up to speed with in that. But also, in terms of looking at the building itself, we're coming across buildings with all sorts of new features in them. And obviously, you talk about a smart home. If a property is a smart home, that sort of implies that it has all sorts of things built into it, either retrofitted or built in as new. And really, the surveyor has to understand how these things work in relation to the traditional sort of issues they look at in terms of condition and type of construction and all this sort of thing. And it may well be that you start to match up that the home actually, a smart home might actually incorporate certain technologies which can talk to the surveyor, whatever role the surveyor is doing. So the surveyor, I can see it's going to be potentially a massive sea change in the way that the surveyor goes about their day-to-day business.
Hi Miranda, welcome to the webinar. Miranda, before we begin, could you please take a moment just to describe your job role to the audience?
So I'm the Business Development Director at South Yorkshire Housing Association. I lead on the growth plan for the business. So that obviously includes building new homes, but also includes strategic asset management in terms of disposals and kind of looking at the sort of overview of the kind of portfolio and MPV and so on. And then I also have our responsibility for our commercial activity, our commercial subsidiary, and generally new enterprise. Also sustainability, which of course ties in a lot with asset management, although it's a very broad view of sustainability right across the piece, and marketing communications as well.
What are the main challenges you face in your industry at the moment?
So I suppose if I relate it specifically to kind of asset management, which is what I was thinking, rather than the sort of broader things, but they are linked, I suppose. So voluntary right to buy is a concern because we are a business that isn't hugely profitable. We are happy to see people buy their own homes, but it's really important to us that we can replace them one for one to sort of, maintain the financial stability of the business. And the problem we have is that our assets are worth probably average 80k a home, and the replacement cost is more like 120k a home. So that is a kind of real challenge for us in terms of it potentially eroding our profitability, whilst it also brings opportunities around, having money to spend on new homes, which is great. We're really core to our purpose to build as much as we can. There's obviously the importance of getting that all to kind of stack up and balance out is what's really important. And I think in terms of asset management, there's a real tension for us around how much do we invest in our existing portfolio, how much do we invest in the quality of new homes if we might actually see them kind of leak away quite quickly through right to buy. So there's a kind of financial and sort of almost moral dilemma about where you set your standards. And I think in terms of generally another thing that probably keeps us awake at night is the tension between our aspirations as a social housing business to provide the best quality homes we can for our customers, whether that's, in terms of investing in existing homes or building new ones, and the fact that the legislative framework doesn't back that up, that we can't compete with the market for land price if we do that. So we're in danger of being sort of drawn in almost to doing the sort of wrong things because the market, and again, particularly a really challenging housing market in Sheffield City region, doesn't actually necessarily support us to do the kind of the right thing. So those are the kind of dilemmas, I think, mainly. The other one is in the kind of context of rent cuts and just generally the changing external environment. We know we have to optimize the income from our portfolio. And again, there are some kind of dilemmas around that. Should we convert some properties to market rent? Do we stick to our guns on social and affordable rent, which is very much where we want to be? So I think there are kind of those the sort of main areas probably for kind of debate and thinking at the moment.
What would you recommend to other housing managers who might be listening, portfolio asset managers listening to the webinar? What would you say is best practice?
Well, I think I don't know, is in terms of the whole picture, but a couple of things that we're kind of very focused on. One is having putting a lot of emphasis on data-driven decisions. So, particularly because I think a lot of the things we're thinking out have a sort of head-heart dilemma almost. So, to what extent can we use data to actually drive those decisions? And using data about our assets and how the sort of almost like the profitability or the performance of individual assets, but also neighbourhood groupings. I should explain that our portfolio is very dispersed. We generally have a pattern of small groups of houses across quite a large geography. So how do those kind of individual assets and neighbourhoods perform? And what does that mean in terms of investment? So just for example, we have a system called Insight for Homes, which helps us look at both the financial and social return on our assets and how they perform generally, how popular they are, what our maintenance and management costs are associated with different things. And that by interrogating that data quite carefully, we've been able to make investment decisions that are perhaps slightly surprising. So, for instance, on one neighbourhood that was, as it were, costing us quite a lot of money to manage, we realised it wasn't so much about the physical asset, it was about marketing the neighbourhood better. The real problem was that it had a poor reputation, people didn't realise we'd improved it, and so it was more about marketing. So I think some of those kind of really looking at the data can lead you into sort of more sort of real and solutions that really address some problems or help you think through what those solutions might be that you wouldn't necessarily automatically turn to. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is we're all operating in a much more kind of commercial environment now. Inevitably, almost every site we look at will be multi-tenure or mixed tenure, and we need to be, I think, much more commercial about how we approach our whole asset base and portfolio. So I think whilst it's really important from my point of view that we hold on to our values, that we remember what our charitable and social purpose is, that we don't try and necessarily become a kind of private sector asset holder or developer or volume house builder. I don't think we should be necessarily trying to do any of those things. I think nonetheless to get a more sort of commercial and take advice from the private sector and a sort of more commercial view on the portfolio and how to kind of work the portfolio as a whole is something really interesting and worth doing.
That's difficult to keep your social compass pointing in the right direction if you're living in a commercial world.
Well, it is and it isn't. I think it depends on your housing market. I mean, actually, in a funny sort of way, although our housing market is one of our biggest challenges, we're also quite lucky in a way because values are generally so low, it doesn't sort of tempt you out of into the kind of market sale, market rent territory in lots of ways. It's not like in the southeast where the potential for making huge profits is there. Of course, there is that potential here, but it's a much more kind of measured. It's a much more challenging environment. So in a way, it makes it. I think we're much less likely, even from just a practical basis, to abandon our social purpose.
What key lessons then have you learned? How long have you been in your current role, Miranda?
I've been here 3.5 years.
And what would you what have you learned in that time about the sector?
So I think, I mean, it's been a huge change during that 3.5 years. I mean, it's just been massive change. I came out of local government actually, so I've been through a period of major change since 2010. You know, that in a way, when I first arrived in the housing association, it felt like, you know, it was a very kind of different environment from local government, much, you know, less exposed, you know, much kind of easier environment in lots of ways. And of course, that's all changed. But I think what's interesting about the sector is that, you know, if you have assets, you have a rent roll, you have some independence and financial security. And that does allow you to make choices, even in a difficult environment, and to really, you know, as I say, consider the data on your market, think really what's going to work and what's not going to work, and then make decisions accordingly. And I think the other thing about housing associations is that, you know, that you are independent, you have an opportunity. Yes, of course, you have to take account of the external environment and government policy, and you have to kind of it's really important that we play our part in delivering on the national agenda around house building and tenure and so on. But equally, we are very long-standing organisations with a long track record and a long history. South Yorkshire Housing Association has been around for more than 40 years. I recently read something that was written by our founder 20 years into the job, so written in the sort of 90s, and honestly, it could have been written yesterday. That was very comforting. It was like he was describing massive change in the external environment, all the tensions around quality and cost, and all the tensions about, you know, who we're here for and all of that. And it was just quite interesting to think, well, there is nothing new here, actually. This has been ever thus. The sector has been grappling with this stuff. It's just a slightly different version of it now, but really, and the sector has, you know, come through and generally kind of adapted and survived and strengthened. So I think the main thing is to kind of, whilst managing the short term and having to be pragmatic to a degree, it's also holding on to that longer term view is really important. And these assets that we build and that we hold, you know, we should hold them for tens, hundreds of years. So it's some of them. So it's, you know, it's important to remember that there is that kind of longer term view, I think.
But fast forward 20, 25 years, what do you think, portfolio manager, what does your job role look like in 25 years, Miranda?
Well, I suppose it's similar themes, really. I think pulling out learning from the data, having really kind of good understanding of the data around assets and being able to make decisions in light of that is I think that'll get more and more so. Our data systems are currently still quite clunky. I'm not sure we're using our data in the most intelligent and best way. So I think there is a thing about really understanding how assets perform. And I think also having that kind of slightly more commercial sort of across the market view. I mean, again, there is a tension between housing associations, you know, all the stuff I said about we want to build and hold these assets forever and they want to be good quality and all that. But actually, on some of them, maybe we shouldn't be holding them forever. Maybe we should be churning them. I mean, it's interesting. The private sector seems to be kind of chopping and changing on that. They've always had a thing, you churn everything in 10 years, you know, you just maximize the value, blah, blah, blah. And now people are saying, well, actually, maybe we should hold on to them for longer. And I do think there's, again, a tension between, you know, the quality of the build if you're planning to dispose of it or whether you want to hold those assets long term, you know, makes a big difference. So I think it's just really understanding what you're trying to do with your portfolio, or there might be bits that you want to hold long term, bits that you're happy not to, you know, and being able to sort of flex accordingly. And I also think being able to kind of flex, I think more and more there will be flexing across 10 years. So for instance, we have two big bits to our business, our kind of general needs housing and our supported housing. And we may well want to kind of look more and more at our asset base being a single asset base that different customers can access, and maybe also looking more across, you know, market rent, market sale, you know, being able to kind of people being able to move across all sorts of different tenures within our portfolio. So I think a sort of broader and yet more granular view of the portfolio will probably be what comes out. That's my hunch.
Do you think there's a role for technology? Is the smart home a thing of the future for your assets? Do you think there'll be intelligent homes that can switch the heating on and off? There is technology out there at the moment that, for instance, will sell energy back to the national grid by licensing your plugs via Wi-Fi to disable things like the kettle during the FA Cup final, because that energy places an enormous amount of stress on the national grid. Do you think that is like a potential revenue stream for you, for your organisation and for your tenants to say, look, we've got 20,000 houses, we can sell all the peak energy and somehow make intelligent homes that make decisions themselves? Is that a role?
I don't know. I mean, we have a success with our power roofs, with what we call our power roofs, PVs, and we've been able to make that stack up and generate some revenue and reduce our customers' bills, and that's been really effective. I suppose for me, there's something about the the upfront cost and whether the benefits are really realised, or whether some of it becomes it's at this stage, whether it's kind of too fiddly, for want of a better word, for us to build in and really kind of make work, and whether the effort to do that is actually going to be kind of repaid. So whilst we are interested in looking, I mean, I just genuinely don't know whether that will work. One area we are interested in is in potentially if we do more in the kind of private rented sector, in terms of kind of larger blocks of homes, or larger kind of, groupings of homes. That might be a place where you're kind of managing a lot of assets in quite a small geography, where the kind of cost of management and maintenance is critical to the business model and so on in a slightly different way. Maybe that's a place where we would look to do that, and where you've got sort of scale, I suppose, and maybe then, and you're holding the assets long term, and maybe then there's a kind of bit more of a kind of payback. But there's been a lot of talk about all of these things, hasn't there, over the years, and it seems to me that yes, there clearly is a place for it. Some of the technologies are simpler than others, and there are clear gains to be had from some. To what extent? I mean, we're not actively looking really at pursuing lots of this stuff at the moment, but that doesn't mean we won't in the future.
You're dead right, Miranda. That end of the market is in its infancy. It's something to consider for new builds, I think, more than retrofits, maybe. Unless
but even then, our biggest challenge is getting our developments to stack up. And if I had to choose between, a better insulated or home to a one that can have tech, you know what I mean? They're really difficult. You probably can't do both. So it's the choices, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. But you need a case study to make that decision, which goes back to what you said earlier on about making data-driven decisions. Moving on to the next one, the stakeholders working together. We've been involved in the energy industry ourselves since 2002, and we've seen things like EEC, the energy efficiency commitment, turn into EEC2, then turn into CESP. We've had HEAPS, SEEPS, HEAPS ABS. In England, we've had the Green Deal go very pear-shaped. Is everyone jaded about legislation?
Well, I suppose the there are two things, aren't there? There's the legislation and there's the sort of funding opportunities, I suppose. I suppose we feel the legislation is pretty important to create a level playing field across the industry, because otherwise you end up with, people who are committed to kind of reducing the carbon footprint or doing the right thing, having to spend more, you know what I mean, their product is less viable as a result. So I think there is something about the legislation backing it up and really kind of cementing it across the board. But in terms of the different funding streams and so on, I think, I suppose our feeling is that you probably need broader coalitions to make it work. The sort of competitive bidding and the fund runs out in 2 days of lots of individual people, bundling in doesn't seem to kind of work terribly well. So I think something about, which I know those broader coalitions are hard to sew and stitch together, but I think there is something about having a more, for instance, at Sheffield City region level approach to, rather than lots of people doing a few homes, that you actually say, right, how do we get bigger projects? And that drives more innovation and again, has more scale. Maybe that's the way to go. I know that's also been looked at, and it's not without its difficulties, but I think that's our feeling. Yeah,
it is tricky. We've seen some clients go to market very early when funding has been announced, and actually it's been detrimental to them, because what's happened is the value of carbon, as the utilities have got more keen to meet their targets, the value of carbon's gone up. And it's actually been beneficial for the laggards, for the people who ignored the legislation. They've gotten more. Which is kind of counterintuitive. You think, go early and win big, but it doesn't really stack up sometimes. Thinking again about the legislation and the funding stability, again, we deal with some utility companies, some insulation companies, some manufacturers, but our core clients are people like yourself. We do a lot we've done something like 250,000 house surveys, and we see the goalposts move about every 6 weeks. If you could wave a magic wand, what would you do to the funding and the legislation?
Well, I suppose I would, on new build, I would certainly want to see some clarity on standards. All those standards have fallen away, and that does mean that there's, what worries me is that there are a lot of homes being built in this country that, will not provide a good legacy. The quality of the build, the quality of their kind of environmental performance will mean that, we're just adding to our problems later downstream. So that does concern me. In terms of kind of more the sort of retrofit stuff, I think if I could wave a magic wand, it would be that we really understand the problems in our asset base and we are able to address those in a kind of sensible way rather than, pitching for funding every 5 minutes. Do you know what I mean? And just think, this week is that, this week is that. Let's, that we can do it in a kind of more planned and sort of strategic way, I suppose.
A bit less feast and famine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just a more kind of coherent and sensible approach, really, that allows different organisations to kind of fund the things that they most need to do rather than just chasing, bits of money for whatever the latest thing is.
And constantly shifting tack. If I can introduce Sebastian to you from OVO Energy. Sebastian looks after the eco obligation for a utility company and has a bit of a different perspective and different take on the industry and the challenges that face him. What are the main challenges in your industry at the moment?
Okay, so I think I probably need to explain that I work in a slightly related field. So obviously there's a lot of asset managers on this conference. I think I come very much from the energy background. And look at it from the energy sector's point of view. Obviously, my background is also in social housing and energy efficiency, but that probably explains the angle a little bit differently. Looking at challenges in the industry in relation to asset management, I think one of the key things is the identification of energy inefficient properties at relatively low cost. I believe this is a wider issue with up-and-coming legislation, which is going to focus a lot more on fuel poverty. And the problem that you've got with fuel poverty is that actually it's probably harder to identify than just energy inefficient properties. So it's that combination of finding energy inefficient properties and finding homeowners or tenants that are fuel poor. Related specifically to what I do, some of the challenges surrounding retrofit works under eco probably relates to fraudulent claims or fraudulent installation claims or increased scoring. Obviously, some other challenges are the smart meter rollout, hard to treat properties and quality installations is always a worry. Solid wall insulation is a big measure to install. It has a big impact on the fabric of the property. So how do you know that's been installed to a high quality? And then, as I mentioned already, the easy identification of fuel poverty is a key driver with some long-term legislation.
Which is, I guess you could do it as twofold for yourself, Seb. What do you recommend as best practice? So what do you do today, and what do you see as the failings, and how would you mitigate that? What would you say?
It's a difficult one to answer in relation to asset management specifically, because again, I haven't sort of been that close to it, and obviously where I'm looking at, I'm dealing with one legislation, then we're looking at additional legislation or the changes in legislation coming down the road. And we don't fully know what that legislation looks like. I mean, it's out in consultation, so we have a good idea, but we've got, a proposed extension to ECO, and then we've got a 4-year new legislation rolling down. So it's hard to sort of recommend any best practice when it's going to change. I think in relation to eco specifically, it's scoping work, knowing what you're doing, knowing what you have to do, adhering to pass. But some of the recommendations for me are maybe looking at. I'm not too keen on getting more and more paperwork, because I think ecos are washing in paperwork. But looking at the quality installations and really improving how you do that, and maybe look at the past. But the other thing for me is getting a good grip of stock data is a best practice. I know this is a hard one, but it's obviously very important. And the other thing that I would recommend really is, and I think this is probably a wider thing, my feeling is that eco is very paper based, and I think we are living in a digital age, and it's amazing how paper-based eco is compared to what digital solutions we have out there. And I think the gulf is too much, and I think part of the complexity of eco is related to all the paperwork. As a recommendation, this is probably to wider policymakers, I would look at the systems that are available and look how that can be upgraded, really.
Your key lesson would be less paperwork, please, and let's digitise.
Yeah, I mean, I've got quite a few. I think key lessons. I think one of the lessons that I've learned, and again, I've moved a little bit away from dealing with social housing providers, but my experience is that most housing providers have, relatively poor insight into their stock. This is not to point the finger, and there are very legitimate reasons for this. A lot of the times it's mergers, different housing associations. One uses one system, the other one uses another system. Relying too much on human knowledge, which is okay if you're a housing association of 5,000 properties, but if you're growing fast, all of a sudden there's less grip on that. So I think that's one. I think the knowledge of their own stock is relatively limited from my experience. I think the other lessons that I've learned, legislation is always very uncertain and prone to massive changes. You can. In my time, I've had the home information packs, the changes to the feed-in tariff, the changes to the energy company obligation. So yeah, those changes are absolutely tremendous. So always be aware that that legislation could be changed from one autumn statement to the next. The other thing, quality is king. You do pay for it, and sometimes people selling the dream or companies selling the dream. You might not always believe them, so try and go for quality where you can. And one other lesson that I think is what I've already touched on is more paperwork does not necessarily improve quality. And I'm when policymakers look at improving quality, they look at it putting more and more compliance. But my experience over the last few years is that it hasn't really driven the quality of installations up as much as you probably assume it would do.
I think that's certainly the BBA's experience as well, in the comments we've had from Claire Curtis-Thomas. I'm sure she'd agree with that. So if you could wave a magic wand then, what is portfolio management, beyond not just social housing, but asset management? What does it look like in 2030? If you could wave that wand, Seb, what would you do to it? What changes would you make?
Yeah, so I actually looked at it the other way. So I didn't look at, what do I want it to look like? I more looked at it like what do I think it's going to look like? What do I assume it's going to look like, rather than saying it should look like this? Really, what will it look like with 2020 vision in 2016? Obviously, I think there's a lot of drivers, trends driving things, and it's funny because they do take effect, but it takes slow, and then all of a sudden you realise you're at a very different point when you look back. From my experience with some of the industries that I worked in, the iPad and iPhone came on, and all of a sudden they're really dominant within a few years. So I think one of the key drivers will be the Internet of Things. I think we'll have much more connected homes. Underpinning that, or relating to that, is the big data revolution. Which is linked to smart meters. They will provide all of that information, half-hourly billing. Again, the impact of that, it's very hard to assess. There's things that you sort of assume and that you think you know, and then there's the stuff that you don't know. I think there's a lot with the Internet of Things that we don't know. A bit like how in 2008, all of a sudden the iPhone apps came on, and all of a sudden we had a marketplace out of nowhere, and you couldn't have foreseen what we do now with mobile phones. I think the Internet of Things will be a similar revolution. I like to also be positive and think that we will have a lot more renewable technology and decentralized energy, which I think will be made made real or will be realised due to battery storage. I think once battery storage will take off, which I think by 2030 it will have, that renewable technology is much more feasible. I think the problem these days is it's finite what you get through renewable energy. You know, if it's windy, you get some energy. If it's not windy, then obviously it doesn't produce any energy. But if you can store it, all of a sudden that becomes a much more viable technology. So I might well think that by 2030, instead of a boiler or, with a boiler comes also a not a boiler-sized battery storage unit, which is able to store most of your energy when you need it. Is what I think portfolio management might look like. And then from an asset management point of view, I think you'll have a lot more insight, again, that big data piece.
Absolutely. So you see a real need for technology is going to really innovate the sector then. You see smart buildings, smart homes, smart grids.
Yeah, I think so. I think it'll be a slow process that will be a bit like a snowball. As I mentioned, my experience with things like the iPhone is you think it does all this, and then the first year you don't actually have that much, but then 3 years down the line you look back and you go, wow, we've moved a far way. Again, I think portfolio management will be a little bit like that. You roll a few smart meters out here, it doesn't seem like it's actually doing that much. But then all of a sudden, I think there'll be a tipping point where you start to rely much more on the insight that you gain from the connected homes, and all of a sudden, and it's probably your next question, but all of a sudden you'll be able to see, actually, we need to repair this on the dashboard a lot more than you've had previously, and carrying out repairs. You might get a signal that flags today's system, i.e. a boiler is going on the blink before it actually goes on the blink. So do smart meters and the Internet of Things present a challenge or an opportunity? Well, firstly, I think I'd like to be sort of positive on that. I think the opportunities are absolutely amazing. I think it absolutely will transform not only the housing sector, but quite a few other sectors. My hope is that it will reduce admin and provide better planning. In better planning, I know how hard it is for housing providers to do a roof repair and to plan that. My belief is that with sensors becoming much cheaper and homes being connected, that it'd be a lot easier to plan for repairs. I believe that homes might be able to predict when they will need repairs. I believe that certain things can be repaired off-site, i.e., might be done over the internet. I think it'll provide a lot deeper and better insight into both tenants, homeowners, and the use of those homes. It makes repairs quicker and easier, and I think we'll probably see a lot of other ancillary applications. I believe humidity sensors for elderly and vulnerable people. I believe this might have an effect on the insurance industry, i.e., a bit more like having the tracker box in your car. It reduces your insurance. I think it's the same with a home. Once you get that aggregated data, you might be able to get cheaper or better targeted insurance. And I think there's also efficiencies to be gained with water efficiencies. My worry is, I touched upon that earlier, the known unknowns. Mm-hmm. And the things that you don't know. So hacking and security are obviously a big concern. We don't know about attacks on smart homes and systems and viruses and what that might do. Who gets your data is another concern. There's a law of unintended consequences. It's quite worrying already when you look at your phone and what data is collected. If you look at the Internet of Things, I think one of the things that's coming out now is people being able to hack baby monitors relatively easy. My baby monitor is on quite a lot. So, those things are a worry. Default passwords, what happens with that? We've got too many to remember anyway. And then the bigger questions is, I don't know how a world without privacy would look like, really. It's this love-hate relationship that we've got with technology. Mm-hmm. You said you've got kids yourself. I think one of the worries that I've got is, when my daughter will be older, there's no switching off particularly. Some kids are bullied. In my day when that was the case, you got home and that was out of the way. Whereas I think for kids today, it's a very different sort of landscape. So yeah, a world without privacy and digital exhaustion is obviously a worry. And then I think the other interesting thing is the Apple thing. What ecosystem are we going to use? Some of us invested in an iPod speaker. Apple changes their port, and all of a sudden you can't use that very expensive speaker. Will there be a dominant ecosystem? So I think there's a lot of question there. I think the opportunities are very positive and something that we definitely have to look at, but there's also a lot of risks that I think at this point in time you might not be able to identify.
What processes can be put in place to ensure clients better understand the challenges ahead and avoid pitfalls?
Obviously, getting up to date and au fait with the new technology is very good. Having a risk and issue register, if you come across issues, identify those issues. If they are reoccurring, then you might have a bigger problem than just one. Having reviews and case studies in place.
How can the stakeholders, how can utilities work with landlords, tenants, social housing providers, commercial portfolio managers? Is there some way you could see that the whole industry could work together better to avoid the mistakes that we've had in the past in the social housing sector?
Well, I think working together would probably avoid quite a lot of mistakes, full stop. I think a lot of the times I did a presentation on this quite a few years ago, mainly on why London, received a disproportionately low amount of funding under CERT and CESP. And looking into that, a lot had to do with the stock type in London, obviously, but also surrounding different departments and planning departments having very restrictions and very different ways of working across the boroughs. And if you've had a housing association that would stretch in one area and another borough, then you had some problems there. So again, that working together was a big thing. If the planning departments work with those departments that do funding and actually understand what it is some of these housing providers are trying to do, that would avoid some of these issues. I think then some failures are probably legislation failures. The Green Deal, it probably didn't work. What can we learn from that? Well, I think one of the things that I think really helps is sharing that information. There's a lot of successful Green Deal schemes, but it wasn't sort of always shared, that information. How can stakeholders work together to avoid mistakes in the past? Case studies is a big one. Using people that have been there before, because even though legislation is new, those people with experience in CERT and CESP and ECO can probably point out some of the big failures. The Bonfield review will obviously, when this comes out, probably be 2018, but I'm still waiting with bated breath. I don't know why it's been so why it's taken so long, but I think that will hopefully will inform the industry as well. It's more of an engagement, really. I think you say, how can stakeholders work together to avoid these pitfalls? I think the answer is probably in the question. They really should work together. Social housing providers can learn a lot, and energy providers can give a lot of information on some of these schemes. So it really is about working together, really.
You referred to the Bonfield review. For those listening who've never heard of Bonfield review, that is Peter Bonfield, who's the CEO of the Building Research Establishment. He's been tasked with what did we do wrong in the past and what should we do in the future. And yes. It has, as you said, Seb, it's been delayed, I think, partially because of Brexit, partially because of partly political leadership changes and things like that. I do believe the report's now called Every Home Matters.
Yeah, that's the one. I knew it was renamed. I tried to rack my brain on what it's called, but I couldn't think of it, really.
Okay. Claire, I know from the BVA, has been in talks, quite close links with Peter Bonfield, actually feeding in best practice from the BVA's experience.
Yep.
They have seen a lot of these failures and abuses firsthand. The last question, do you think a long period of legislative and funding stability would help the sector? And if so, what should it look like? And sub-question, is legislation the only true driver?
there's been a long campaign of lobbying for longer-term legislation. I think it's very clear that that would benefit everyone involved. We keep having the stop-start nature within the industry. You see the solid wall industry ramping up, then eco changes, it ramps down, and then there's the period of uncertainty. We've had that on the CERT, CESP. Hopefully we're not going to get that with eco. I think they have sort of committed to that. If you look at the warm homes discount, that's got a 5-year certainty. If you look at the future of eco, it's got a 1-year extension and a 4-year certainty. So A, I think it's being recognised, and B, yes, it would definitely help. I think one other thing that I'd probably like to say is one, my frustration in the last decade has been, feed-in tariffs, home information packs, energy performance certificates, and energy, the energy company obligation is one of, well, particularly the Green Deal is one of pivoting and change. I think in government they either invent the perfect policy or it gets binned. Mm-hmm. But as you know, with starting a business, you sometimes have to change, tweak things, and then make some changes to it. Look at the Green Deal. That was going to be the biggest retrofit scheme since World War II. When we had the soft launch, that probably wasn't a launch because the software really wasn't ready, and so we go ahead anyway because politicians probably don't want to make a U-turn. We go ahead anyway, and then it finally seems to be getting some traction, and actually we then bin it completely. I don't know where we are with the Green Deal now. There's obviously a lot of uncertainty, and really in the case of the Green Deal and with some other pieces of legislation, assessing what the marketplace does and then making some changes and going ahead would be very welcome, rather than saying this is how we're going to run it, and then because they haven't got an easy job. There's so many different stakeholders involved in all of this. Mm-hmm. Think about all the installation companies, think about all the subcontractors, think about the local authorities, councils, housing associations, energy providers. So it's not easy. So I think there's some things that you might not even be able to predict, but just binning it basically makes it into a bit of a disaster. Whereas if you just make some tweaks, assessed it again, make some more tweaks, I think that would be much more helpful. Then on to the final part, is legislation the only true driver? Probably not. I think it helps. I think legislation really should be there to be the driver to set things up. So I think the feed-in tariff was probably arguably very successful in kickstarting the solar industry. So I think probably legislation should be looked at that.
We have Claire Curtis-Thomas on this webinar from the BBA, who's the Chief Executive Officer. Unfortunately, Claire has been held up and can't physically make the live webinar, so we have prepared a plan B, which is Claire's written words. So I'll just run through the answers that Claire gave from the BBA. In answer to our first question posed, what are the main challenges in your industry at the moment? Claire answered, the construction industry continues to make progress despite the lack of consistent government policy. Whilst ministers espouse grand plans and ambition, there is frequently a lack of coherent initiatives and enforcement activities to deliver these. These omissions drive uncertainty and hinder construction product development programs. Question 2, when asked, what would you recommend as best practice? Claire responded, purchasers of products and services must satisfy themselves that A, the products are fit for purpose, and B, installers understand the products they are installing and are appropriately trained and assessed. Number 3, what key lessons have you learnt from the sector? Answer, a lack of assessment or enforcement of standards leads to a proliferation of poor practices and outcomes. What do you think Portfolio Management 2030 looks like? The development of data management architecture and data sharing protocols will provide property descriptions which will make community investment decisions easier and more effective. Do smart meters and the Internet of Things present a challenge or opportunity? Is the sector ready for them? Will tenants embrace technology? And who pays for them? Claire's answer was smart meters are inevitable. Adoption and effective deployment is clearly dependent on a literate user. Producers of new technology will increasingly focus on the creation of smart interfaces, which will allow end users to interact with the systems easily. Question 6. What processes can be put in place to ensure clients better understand the challenges ahead and avoid pitfalls? A major challenge is the creation of smart interfaces between users and electronic devices, and how the development of plain-speaking literature which promotes new, increasingly complex ideas and products to savvy, poor purchasers. Question 7. How can stakeholders work together to ensure we avoid the mistakes made in the past? Thinking about CERT, CES, Green Deal failure, fuel poverty, failed cavities, damp homes. The Bonfield Review is an excellent start, and hopefully with government backing will generate the platforms which are necessary for all parts of the industry to work together. And lastly, for Claire, do you think a long period of legislative and funding stability would help the sector? If so, what should it look like? And is legislation the only true driver? Claire's answer was, of course stability would be wonderful, but reality points to government setting a very low level sense of direction, leaving the market to pick up the inference and run with it. Signed global agreements are very helpful and ultimately have to be delivered. I'd like to think that the population left to its own devices would do the right thing, but it's susceptible and ultimately looks to government for reassurance. So let's have a quick look at one solution for managing your housing stock electronically through software. We, IRT Surveys, have developed a piece of software called DREAM, which is the Dynamic Retrofit Energy and Asset Management Portal. What you do here is no matter which asset management system you're currently using, you create a CSV file from it and you drag and drop it straight into DREAM. What DREAM then does is basically run all of your data that you've uploaded through SAP 2009 or 2012. That's quite a handy function if you're trying to meet targets or leverage eco-funding. But it also does things like map all of your information straight into Google Earth with a coloured dot to represent the EPC certificate. So what you're looking at here is one of our stakeholders who helped us develop the software. This is 36,000 houses from North Lanarkshire Council, all mapped in here, 10,000 of which we've actually taken infrared images on as well. So in Google Earth you can create a small group, you can drag a little box around one specific area. You can say, hey, call that whatever you like, call it a town name, call it a specific social deprivation 1, whatever you like to call it, my bungalows. But you can save it as a little group, go back to the dashboard page, and then start interacting with just those houses. You'll see this on the left-hand side here. You'll see a little sample group. You can start interacting with it and see the EPC ratings, the SAP ratings, the address information, etc. Once you've created your group, you can share it with the maintenance department. You can share it with your chosen partners, utility companies, whomever you like, direct from the DREAM system. So you get a nice integrity overview as well. Now what DREAM does is it actually uses about 200 templates to backfill missing data. So if you only know a handful of data points about a specific home, we can actually populate that with intelligent assumptions, albeit they are still assumptions, but it will help throw up anomalies. If you've paid £20 and had an EPC that says it's an F or a B, it will throw up anomalies and say, hang on, we've used exactly the same software and we've come up with an E rating. There's something going wrong with your data. You can see that very quickly in the top right in a red, amber, green traffic light analysis. And the reports themselves are really dynamic. You can say, look, show me my worst 5 properties, show me my best. But you can also set targets and say, look, I'm interested in improving my SAP rating, better than 73 for at least 40% of my stock. Go for it. Show me how can I do that. And that's exactly what DREAM can do for you. Now, one of the coolest features that DREAM does is you can actually set a budget. You can say, look, my budget is £250,000. How do I meet that target? How do I get there? And it automatically calculates and then helps you find the lowest hanging fruit within the data set. that we've provided. And again, you can go back and look at each individual home. The software will calculate improvements and say, look, what you need to do is a boiler in this house, loft insulation in this one, glazing in this one, and help you meet those targets. However, the very best feature that DREAM has is its automation. You can actually set alerts and say things like, I want you to email me every time legislation changes. I want you to show me when energy prices go up. Who has it pushed into fuel poverty? Where are they? How do I get them out of fuel poverty? All those criteria are all customizable, but the main thing that DREAM does is completely automate it, and it de-skills it. You do not need an energy expert or someone with a vested interest to sit and tell you which products or services you need. DREAM completely agnostically does that for you, and that's all on a monthly subscription basis. So the actual capex is very low, and it's a fixed known cost that keeps you bang up to date with legislation. During the webinar, we've had around 15 questions come in. Given the time constraints, we'll try and deal with 4 or 5 of them at the moment, and email the rest, answers to the rest around after the event if we can. So first question we have, I'll keep the person who asked the question anonymous. First question up was, we have a portfolio of 10,000 homes and find getting access difficult from our tenants. Getting accurate data is difficult. Do the panel see the Internet of Things as part of the future? Can a sensor take the place of a visit? I guess I'll field that one myself. Yes and no would be the answer. Sensors can only do so much. It would be great if they could tell us everything, but I don't think you can ever replace someone with expertise and knowledge on a human level being able to get access and actually look at things with their own 2 eyes. There's definitely a big bright future for the Internet of Things though, and I do think buildings are going to get a lot more intelligent in the future. The second question we've had, our association has a freeze on CapEx. We know our data is poor, but we can't afford proper RICS surveys on every home. What are my options? I'm sure Graham from RICS would say go and dig up some budget and see if you can do them over a longer period of time. I think the honest answer is you've got to do as much as you can digitally in the first instance. We've struggled with this with infrared surveys for 15 years. Everyone would like thermal images and RICS surveys on every single home they have. It's the most accurate option out there, but budgets are what they are. This next question is really simple, but very complicated to answer. It simply says, what can I do to save the most amount of carbon quickly? It's really difficult to say. You will save lots of carbon by changing boilers. There's a whole army of people out there who will say, do fabric first, buy insulation. And there's a whole other army of people out there who will say, actually, if you can get the tenants just to turn their radiators down, that'll make the biggest difference the most quickly at absolutely no cost. It's difficult to control tenants, be they commercial tenants or domestic tenants. So it's a bit of I'm sorry I'm being a little bit vague with the answer here. I would say personally, I'd say do the fabric first, and then that way your heating is on less, and then change the boiler, and that way you're then saving lots more because the fabric is at least efficient. So every kilowatt you buy is being used effectively. I hope that answers your question. This next question, I think I can confidently answer this for all the panelists. Quite simply says, we are fed up with legislation changing all the time. Is there a period of calm on the horizon? I think we all share your frustration, whoever wrote this question. It would be lovely if there was a long 10-year period of calm. It looks unlikely. It looks like there's going to be constant change. There's always a political agenda. There's always monetary reasons and shifting sand to deal with. At the moment, Eco3 is coming. It's on the horizon, and it will be with us for 2 or 3 years. But even then, there will be nuances within it that will mean utility companies are constantly seeking something slightly different, and each utility will be looking for something slightly different as they go through their targets. I can't really answer that question any better than that, but we are all a little bit fed up and a little bit jaded with the constant shifting sand. How real are the minimum performance regulations and do they apply to the sector? This is a real minefield. We've had some clients say, yes, we're paranoid about the minimum energy performance standards that are coming into place in 2018. We've had other clients say, nope, they're not bothered, make me a solid business case and I'll invest in it. It does look likely that it's going to happen, and it basically means you can't buy, sell, rent or lease a building that's an F or a G rated. It's estimated that that is about 1/3 of the built environment. So it is very real. If you have assets that you currently rent or you're looking to sell them, being compliant is quite a challenge. What will happen come 2018? Your guess is as good as mine. There may well be honeymoon periods. They may well relax the legislation a little bit. They may well move the minimum threshold. But yeah, the performance certificates, it looks like it is quite a real piece of legislation. Are deemed scores a good idea or just a mechanism for utility companies to meet their target more easily without doing proper investigative work? Wow, that's a loaded question. Deemed scores, I think they have their place. The concept is that they will help, again, accelerate the retrofit market and make it a little bit more of a level playing field. The downside is that if you physically measure it, you may get a different answer from the deemed, and already that's taken place where people are physically measuring it, and if the answer is bad and they don't want to share it, then they go with the deemed, and if vice versa, if it helps them, they go with the other version. So there's good and bad. Our association has a freeze on CapEx. We know our data is poor, but we can't afford proper RICS surveys on every home. What are my options? That's a tricky one. Everyone has CapEx problems these days. It's a fairly common post-2008 problem. The best thing to do is start with the data. You've got to plug those gaps in the data, understand the condition of your assets, and address some low-hanging fruit, and instruct proper professional surveys on a limited basis, an affordable basis. But that is definitely the best way forward. Most cost-effective way is to do data stuff first and then deploy knowledgeable, expensive people on a smaller percentage. In our stock condition survey last year, we identified a large number of damp homes that had their cavities filled less than 5 years ago. How can we prevent cowboys drilling and filling like they did last time round? Probably best Claire Curtis-Thomas. That's right up your alley, Claire. But I guess the honest answer, again, is do before and after surveys. You've got to understand your data, and you've got to police these things, and you've got to hold people accountable and test it and prove the efficacy of what they're actually claimed to be doing. Legislation can help, but again, you've got to monitor it, would be my advice. This next question, we don't pay the energy bill on our stock. Why should we continue to invest in property and follow EU rules when we have left the EU? How can you say we aren't wasting our time? I do appreciate the frustration in this question, and it's one we come across bizarrely quite frequently, especially in the commercial sector, when so many buildings are rented out. I guess the answer is you have to look at the bigger picture and say, look, we're doing something beneficial for the environment, which is good, doing something for our tenants to help them get out of fuel poverty and live healthy, happier lives. But from a fiscal point of view, you are maintaining your assets. You are improving the value of them. So despite the fact the savings are the tenant savings and not the landlord savings, there still is merit in having an actual efficient portfolio of assets. I hope that answers that question for you. Again, it's very difficult to give you hard and fast numbers on what they are, but if we can, we'll circulate information after the webinar. This next question is an absolute doozy, and it's nigh on impossible to answer. The question simply says, what's the net impact likely to be on my portfolio if I do nothing in monetary terms? I guess the short answer is nothing beneficial. If you sit and bury your head in the sand, you will be missing out on grant opportunities, funding opportunities, and the assets will depreciate. They're certainly not going to get better on their own. the overall, in terms of percentage, very difficult to say. If it happens to be in an up-and-coming area, I guess even doing nothing, the assets may well go up in value, even though the quality goes down. But again, a good property in a good area is going to be worth more than a bad property in a good area. So doing nothing is certainly not going to help matters. I'm pretty sure everyone would agree. But again, Miranda's probably best placed to answer that in a professional capacity, and we'll do that offline at the end of the webinar. Does anyone know what Eco3 looks like yet? Probably Sebastian, you'll be best able to answer this one after the webinar's concluded. We can circulate the answer to this. From my point of view, the answer is not really. It's a bit of a Donald Rumsfeld answer. There are things we know, there are things we know, and there are things we know we don't know. It looks like the money is going to be sent to the utilities, sorry, not to the utilities, but out to the local authorities and housing associations themselves, instead of going via the utility companies. There'll be pros and cons to that, people getting to grips with how the funding mechanism works, but it looks like it's going to be smoother, easier, and a lot less paperwork, which should help accelerate retrofits UK-wide. That concludes our webinar for today, folks. I hope you enjoyed it. Certainly found some points fairly enlightening and informative this end myself. Please visit our website, irtsurveys.co.uk, and you can ask any questions, download case studies, follow our blogs. Thank you once again to our panellists, to Miranda, to Claire, Sebastian and Graham, and I hope you all enjoyed it. We had over 200 people today online, and I hope you found it informative, and we'll attend the next one.